The Scott Monument on Edinburgh's Princes Street stands at 200 feet high, the second largest monument to any writer in the world. Walter Scott sits at its centre, looking forward to Edinburgh's new town, where the future and the present of Scotland during Scott's time, and also in front of Edinburgh's old town, where much of the histories and the stories that Scott would tap into and use for many of his poems and novels. Today, the Scott Monument provides something of a landmark for those unfamiliar with Edinburgh city centre. It's something of a monument or a landmark that they can use to navigate the city perhaps, but also the city's residents, a meeting place and somewhere prominent in the Edinburgh skyline. And so the Scott Monument, as much as being a monument to the writer, it also shows the vast influence that Scott has had over Scotland and remains to have until the present day. But also it shows as well the vast influence that Edinburgh had upon Scott's fictions. For as much as many of the poems and novels give us names by which we know how to navigate the city today, Waverley, the famous train station, Chronicles of the Canongate, the Heart of Midlothian, lots of those stories and the tales and traditions and the history came from Scott's knowledge of Edinburgh itself. And so as much as Scott has had an influence on Scotland and Edinburgh, today what I'd like to look a little bit more into is the influence that Edinburgh had upon Scott and how that was brought to bear on many of his poems and novels. Walter Scott was born on the 15th of August 1771 in Edinburgh's Old Town, on College Wynd in fact, not far from this site. Now, the part of College Wynd on which Scott was born no longer exists. In fact, it was cleared away late in the 19th century to make way for some of the buildings that are now on Chambers Street, just above where I stand. But the old town that Scott was born into, these steps that I'm standing on, bear something of the character of that old town street on which he was born. So something of the slightly sinister, or let's say atmospheric, sort of subterranean feeling that we get today. Now, it was partly because of that old town characteristic, the slightly insanitary, very overcrowded feel that that street had, and partly because Scott was a very sickly young child, that his parents sent him away to the Scottish borders to Roxburghshire to live with his paternal grandparents at Sandyknow Farm. Now, whilst he was there, he soaked up many of the tales and traditions of Scottish border lore, tales of heroes and outlaws and ballads and all sorts of things like this that really had a strong impact on his imagination. And he brought those to future poems and novels, from the Lay of the Last Minstrel right the way through to the monastery. And so the borders had a huge imaginative impact on Scott. But it wasn't the borders alone that Scott would turn to when he was writing his poems and novels. Indeed, when he came back to Edinburgh, he found that there were just as many stories and just as much history to be soaked up in the slightly more gritty than the borders, but in the city itself. And so as he became a young man, he turned to lots of those stories and became accustomed with Scotland's history here in the city. From 1779, Scott attended the Royal High School, at this time in the buildings here at High School Yards. This itself is an interesting sight. Mary Queen of Scots' second husband, Henry Lord Darnley, was discovered murdered in a garden which once grew here. It is tempting to think that this is precisely the sort of grisly tale with a grounding in reality for which Scott would gain the reputation of resident storyteller during his school years. He wrote that during the winter play hours, when hard exercise was impossible, my tales used to assemble an admiring audience round Lucky Brown's fireside. Scott himself confessed that his own enthusiasm in stories at this time lay in the wonderful and the terrible, the common taste of children. And so the city's stories of murders and scandals would have been irresistible to a schoolboy storyteller such as Scott, and perhaps one of the most infamous stories that Scott would have been able to tell was that of the notorious cabinet maker turned thief by night Deacon Brodie, discovered and executed when Scott was still a teenager. Through both storytelling and through study, Scott's school years would have helped to consolidate his probably already significant knowledge of Scottish history, and also this would have been consolidated through walking. A keen walker from a young age, Scott was instructed by his father only to walk as far as would permit him to be away and back again within the same day, and so his geographical as well as his imaginative rambles were reliant on what the city of Edinburgh itself could provide, from tales of the Covenanters or Jacobite stories to the more modern-day narratives. It was at this time also that Scott began collecting the touch pieces of his fictions, the treasured items connected to Scottish history. In his father's house in George Square, he assembled a collection of out-of-the-way things of all sorts. He had more books than shelves, a small painted cabinet with Scotch and Roman coins in it, a claymore and a Lochaber axe. Even as a youth, shadows of the Waverley novels yet to come presented themselves to Scott in events, history, and in objects. Edinburgh's Royal Mile must be one of the most recognisable streets, certainly in the city, possibly anywhere in the world. A bold seam that runs right the way through the city centre, reaching from Edinburgh Castle at the top on Castle Rock and all the way down to the Palace of Holyrood House, where in 1822 Scott would meet with George IV, the first visit of a reigning monarch to the city in almost 200 years. Now, many of the buildings that Scott would have recognised on the Royal Mile are no longer existent to this day. The old toll booth, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, the old prison, is no longer there. It was demolished in 1817. Other buildings, including the Black Turnpike building, which Scott described as a long black snail, which would have been just outside the Tron Kirk, is also no longer in existence. But that would have obscured some of the great wide street that we have today. And also the looking booths, the locked booths or market stalls, which would have been near to Parliament Square as well, are no longer in existence. And so whilst there's been changes over the centuries since Scott was here in Edinburgh, we probably would have recognised much of the street as we see it today, as it was in his day. And testimony to that is the description that we get of the Royal Mile in Scott's 1820 novel, The Abbot. Now, The Abbot is set in 16th century Scotland, and it centres on the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, one of Scotland's most famous monarchs. And Scott had a very pertinent reason for turning to writing about Mary, Queen of Scots when he did. He'd had rather a miserable reception to his most recent novel of the same year, The Monastery, and so he sought to take to writing the story of one of Scotland's most famous protagonists with the best story that he could think of. And he explained his reason for writing about Mary, Queen of Scots in his preface to The Abbot. And this is the reason he gave. There occur in every country some peculiar historical characters which are, like a spell or charm, sovereign to excite curiosity and attract attention, since every one in the slightest degree interested in the land which they belong to has heard much of them and longs to hear more. And so the description that we get of the Royal Mile in The Abbot of Mary, Queen of Scots, Scotland, is actually seen through the eyes of Mary's page, Roland Graham. And it's the first time he's ever visited the city, and you can tell in this description just how overwhelmed and overawed he is by what he sees in the buildings that surround him.
The principal street of Edinburgh was then, as now, one of the most spacious in Europe. The extreme height of the houses and the variety of Gothic gables and battlements and balconies by which a skyline on each side was crowned and terminated, together with the width of the street itself, might have struck with surprise even the more practised eye than that of young Graham. The population, close packed within the walls of the city, and at this time increased by the number of lords of the king's party who had thronged to Edinburgh to wait upon the Regent Murray, absolutely swarmed like bees on the wide and stately street. Instead of the shop windows, which are now calculated for the display of goods, the traders had their open booths projecting on the street, in which, as in the fashion of the modern bazaars, all was exposed which they had upon sale. And though the commodities were not of the richest kinds, yet Graham thought he beheld the wealth of the whole world in the various bales of Flanders cloths and the specimens of tapestry. And at other places, the display of domestic utensils and pieces of plate struck him with wonder. The sight of cutlers' booths, furnished with swords and poniards which were manufactured in Scotland, and with pieces of defensive armour imported from Flanders, added to his surprise. And at every step he found so much to admire and gaze upon that Adam Woodcock had no little difficulty in prevailing him to advance through such a scene of enchantment.
So as we hear in that description there of Roland Graham's perception of Edinburgh when he arrives in the city for the first time, Scott's describing the architecture of the Royal Mile with a real sense of pride in his home city, in his hometown. It's not the only occasion where we receive just such a description. In fact, in The Fortunes of Nigel, the manservant of the titular character Nigel arrives in the city of London, and in a particularly witty exchange he defends the honour and the integrity of his home city of Edinburgh and all the famous features of that city against the suggested superiority of the English capital.
"Come, jockey, out with it," continued Master George, observing that the Scot, as usual with his countrymen when asked a blunt, straightforward question, took a little time before answering it. "I am no more jockey, sir, than you are John," said the stranger, as if offended at being addressed by a name which at the time was used, as sorely now is, for a general appellative of the Scottish nation. "My name, if you must know it, is Richie Moneyplies, and I come of the old and honourable house of Castle Collop, wheel kenned at the west port of Edinburgh." "What is that you call the west port?" proceeded the interrogator. "Why, an it like your honour," said Richie, who now, having recovered his senses sufficiently to observe the respectable exterior of Master George, threw more civility into his manner than at first, "the west port is a gate of our city, as yonder brick arches at White Hall form the entrance of the King's Palace here, only that the west port is of stone ironwork, and mair decorated with architecture and the policy of bigging." "Nouns, man, the Whitehall gateways were planned by the great Holbein," answered Master George. "I suspect your accident has jumbled your brains, my good friend. I suppose you will tell me next you have at Edinburgh as fine a navigable river as the Thames, with all its shipping?" "The Thames!" exclaimed Richie, in a tone of ineffable contempt. "God bless your honour's judgment. We have at Edinburgh the water of Leith and the Nor Loch."
Choosing any of the closes that run off Edinburgh's Royal Mile to walk down has the promise of a good story at the end of it, and this particular close is no exception. Now, part of the promise of the magic and mystery of a good story is lent by the house that stands behind me, now known as the Writers' Museum, or Lady Stair's house. Now, it wasn't always called this. In fact, the house was first built in 1622 by Sir William Grey of Pittenweem, and it became known as Lady Grey's house after his death in 1648. When his widow continued to live there, and she gave the house its first name. It had a change of name with a change of resident early in the 18th century in 1719, when Elizabeth, Dowager Countess of Stair, moved into the premises, and she gave the name of Stair to the house and the close as we know them today. So certainly by Scott's lifetime in the late 18th century and early 19th century, the close and the house would have been known by the name of Stair, and it would have brought a certain association with a very tragic story associated with the family. Now, the story goes that Janet Dalrymple, who was the daughter of the Viscount Stair, she fell in love with a Lord Ruthven. She became secretly engaged to him. However, he wasn't the choice of her parents, and they forbade the marriage. Instead, they proffered an alternative, David Dunbar, and Janet and he were married on the 24th of August 1669. Incidentally, also the same day that Janet actually attempted the life of her new husband, suffered a complete breakdown and didn't survive for 2 weeks beyond that point. So a very tragic story, one that Scott certainly knew, and in fact if it sounds familiar to the avid Scott reader, it certainly should, because this of course is the plot also of The Bride of Lammermoor. And Scott did confess later in the preface of the novel that he did take inspiration from the story of Stair. Now, in Scott's novel, Janet Dalrymple is replaced by Lucy Ashton, and Lord Ruthven, the man that she wanted to marry, the man that Janet wanted to marry, is replaced by Edgar Ravenswood. And so Scott takes lots of the details of that story and writes them into his novel. And it's tempting to think that as Scott was walking to work in the centre of the city's Royal Mile, in the legal centre of the city, that he might have thought about the types of scenes that would become part of that novel as he wandered past this magical, mysterious house. And so we'll hear an excerpt of that tragic wedding day scene as Scott writes it in The Bride of Lammermoor, and I should warn you in advance, it's not a happy scene to listen to.
The instruments now played their loudest strains, The dancers pursued their exercise with all the enthusiasm inspired by youth, mirth, and high spirits, when a cry was heard so shrill and piercing as at once to arrest the dance and the music. All stood motionless. But when the yell was again repeated, all rushed thither to the bridal chamber, whilst the bridal guests waited their return in stupefied amazement. Arrived at the door of the apartment, Colonel Ashton knocked and called, but received no answer except stifled groans. He hesitated no longer to open the door of the apartment, in which he found opposition from something which lay against it. When he had succeeded opening it, the body of the bridegroom was found lying on the threshold of the bridal chamber, and all around was flooded with blood. A cry of surprise and horror was raised by all present, and the company, excited by this new alarm, began to rush tumultuously towards the sleeping apartment. Colonel Ashton first whispering to his mother, "Search for her, she has murdered him," drew his sword, planted himself in the passage, and declared he would suffer no man to pass excepting the clergyman and a medical person present. By their assistance, the bridegroom, who still breathed, was raised from the ground and transported to another apartment, where his friends, full of suspicion and murmuring, assembled round him to learn the opinion of the surgeon. In the meanwhile, Lady Ashton, her husband, and their assistants in vain sought Lucy in the bridal bed and in the chamber. There was no private passage from the room, and they began to think she must have thrown herself from the window, when one of the company, holding his torch lower than the rest, discovered something white in the corner of the great old-fashioned chimney of the apartment. Here they found the unfortunate girl seated, or rather couched like a hare upon its form, her headgear dishevelled, her night-clothes torn and dabbled with blood, her eyes glazed, and her features convulsed into a wild paroxysm of insanity. When she saw herself discovered, she gibbered, made mouths, and pointed at them with her bloody fingers, with the frantic gestures of an exulting demoniac.
Son of a writer to the Signet and himself a man of law, Scott would have spent a large part of his day-to-day life when here in Edinburgh in this central part of the Royal Mile, the legal heart of the city. And this street that I'm standing on now, Advocates Close, takes its name from the first Lord Advocate of Scotland, Sir James Stewart. Now, Scott's day-to-day life would have been, as I say, in this part of the city, and lots of the closes that lead off from the Royal Mile would have actually been lined with inns and taverns and public houses, which might have been something of a temptation to the young advocates such as Scott, especially when he was studying at the University of Edinburgh and young in his legal profession. And now Scott gives us a good example of a sort of custom that was practiced amongst people of the law, of young advocates, partaking in a daily jaunt to John's Coffee House, which appears to be something of an Edinburgh institution at this time, frequented by lawyers, advocates, philosophers and writers of the city. He describes this custom, this daily jaunt to John's Coffee House, to partake of something called the meridian, which we would probably just call a bumper dram of brandy. But we'll hear that description as it appears in a note in Red Gauntlet in Scott's own words.
This small, dark coffee house, now burnt down, was the resort of such writers and clerks belonging to the Parliament House about 30 years ago, as retained the ancient Scottish custom of a meridian, as it was called, or noontide dram of spirits. If their proceedings were watched, they might be seen to turn fidgety about the hour of noon, and exchange looks with each other from their separate desks, till at length some one of formal and dignified presence assumed the honour of leading the band, when away they went, threading the crowd like a string of wildfowl, crossed the square or close, and following each other into the coffee house, received in turn from the hand of the waiter the meridian, which was placed ready at the bar. This they did day by day, and although they did not speak to each other, they seemed to attach a certain degree of sociability to performing the ceremony in company.
Scott was called to his life as an advocate in 1792, and for the next 30 years he practiced a legal profession, writing alongside all the while. And so it would have been here that he would have come to his work on a day-to-day basis when he was in Edinburgh, here in Parliament Hall, which is the oldest part of the building, and the Advocates' Library, both of which were built in around the mid to late 17th century. Now, Scott would have also soaked up lots of the historical atmosphere of Edinburgh whilst he was here. He's got St Giles Cathedral on one side and his daily walk to work before he reaches Parliament Hall, and indeed where I'm standing now, the tarmac beneath at one time would have been the kirkyard of St Giles Cathedral, and the religious reformer John Knox actually is buried in this spot just here as well. So it's tempting to think that Scott, as he walked to work each day, he would have been aware of the historical significance of where it was he was actually going, and those imaginative possibilities that surrounded him would have been quite enticing and quite exciting. And more so because although he was hard working in his legal profession, he wasn't extremely passionate about it. In fact, at one point he described it as a prison house. He felt that his work imprisoned him in some way. And so in this way, although he shared a profession with his father, although they were both involved in the law, they felt very differently about the legal profession. And now there's a wonderful example of an exchange that may have happened in the real Scott household between father and son, which is sort of mirrored slightly in Red Gauntlet. Now, Red Gauntlet takes as the main thrust of the novel is set in a fictional Jacobite uprising of 1765, and it's another attempt to regain the throne for the by then rather old young pretender, and to put him back on the throne. And so the hero of the novel, Alan Fairford, he's a young advocate, and he goes on an adventure to rescue his friend Darcy Latimer from being embroiled in this Jacobite plot. Now, the exchange that we're about to hear takes place between, it's an exchange that's proffered between Alan Fairford and his father, and as I say, in just the opposite attitudes to the legal profession that we get, it may have also been the type of conversation that one might have overheard in the Scott household.
Alan, you know where to go. Ye have opened shop, as we would say of a more mechanical profession, and doubtless ye think the floor of the courts is strewed with guineas, and that ye have only to stoop down and gather them.
I hope I am sensible, sir, that I have some knowledge and practice to acquire, and must stoop for that in the first place.
It is well said, very well said, if it be well acted up to. Stoop to get knowledge and practice is the very word. Ye know very well, Alan, that in the other faculty who study the ars modendi, before the young doctor gets to the bedsides of palaces, he must, as they call it, walk the hospitals and cure Lazarus of his sores before he be admitted to prescribe for dives when he has gout or indigestion.
I am aware, sir, that...
Whisht, do not interrupt the court. Well, also, the surgeons have a useful practice, by which they put their apprentices to work upon senseless dead bodies, to which, as they can do no good, so they certainly can do as little harm, while at the same time the tyro, or apprentice, gains experience and becomes fit to whip off a leg or arm from a living subject, as cleanly as you would slice an onion.
I believe I guess your meaning, sir, and were it not for a very particular
Do
engagement...
not speak to me of engagements, but whisht, there is a good lad, and do not interrupt the court.
A room within the oldest part of this building makes a direct appearance in Scott's novel of 1816, The Tale of Old Mortality. It appears that Scott draws upon his precise and personal experience of the rooms in this building and chooses the atmospheric Laigh Hall to provide the scene of a particularly grim chapter of the novel, in which protagonist Henry Morton is sentenced to exile and Covenanter Ephraim McBriar is subjected to a sentence far worse. Now, the room itself is described as being the room in which the Privy Council of Scotland meet, and it's described by Scott as being an ancient, dark, Gothic room adjoining to the House of Parliament in Edinburgh. In the following scene, which you'll hear a short excerpt from shortly, Scott also draws liberally too upon his imagination to supply details, and also possibly upon some of the many rather macabre objects that he housed in his museum collection in Abbotsford. The legal aspects of Red Gauntlet are, of course, secondary to the main thrust of the work, the fictional Jacobite uprising of 1765. But Red Gauntlet was not the first of Scott's Jacobite works, rather it was the third, emerging 7 years after Rob Roy, published in 1817, and a full decade after the first Jacobite novel, Scott's first ever novel, Waverley, published in 1814. Scott, as a loyal Unionist, suffered a rather head versus heart relationship with the Jacobite cause, which has led to many reading the wavering character of Edward Waverley as a reflection of Scott's own feelings. Waverley, a soldier of the Hanoverian army, finds that he is romantically inclined towards the cause of the Stewart prince after a protracted stay in the Scottish Highlands, where he meets the impressive Fergus MacIvor and his beautiful, passionate sister Flora. Scott's own great-grandfather, fondly known as Beardy, had declared that he would neither shave his head nor trim his beard until a Stewart was restored to the Scottish throne. And though Scott, if Raeburn's paintings are anything to go by, was always a rather clean-shaven man, his sentiments in many ways seem to have followed those of old Beardy, although his practical support was pro-Union and Hanoverian. It seems as though Scott gave articulation to this conflict of emotions in a scene depicting the meeting between Edward Waverley and Charles Edward Stewart here in the palace of Holyrood House, where the prince set up court for 6 weeks in September 1745. Now, in describing this meeting, Scott shows great familiarity with the building of the palace itself. Waverley is conducted through a long, low, ill-proportioned gallery, or rather the Great Gallery, to the presence chambers where he first encounters the Stewart prince, and their meeting is described as follows.
A young man wearing his own fair hair, distinguished by the dignity of his mien and the noble expression of his well-formed and regular features, advanced out of a circle of military gentlemen and Highland chiefs, by whom he was surrounded. In his easy and graceful manners, Waverley afterwards thought he could have discovered his high birth and rank, although the star on his breast and the embroidered garter at his knee had not appeared as its indications. "Let me present to your Royal Highness," said Fergus, bowing profoundly,
"the descendant of one of the most ancient and loyal families in England,"
said the young Chevalier, interrupting him.
"I beg your pardon for interrupting you, my dear MacIvor, but no master of ceremonies is necessary to present a Waverley to a Stewart."
Thus saying, he extended his hand to Edward with the utmost courtesy, who could not, had he desired it, have avoided rendering him the homage which seemed due to his rank, and was certainly the right of his birth.
"I am sorry to understand, Mr. Waverley, that, owing to circumstances which have been as yet but ill-explained, you have suffered some restraint among my followers in Perthshire on your march here. But we are in such a situation that we hardly know our friends, and I am even at this moment uncertain whether I can have the pleasure of considering Mr. Waverley as among mine."
He then paused for an instant, but before Edward could adjust a suitable reply, or even arrange his ideas as to its purport, the prince took out a paper, and then proceeded.
"I should indeed have no doubts upon this subject if I could trust to this proclamation, set forth by the friends of the Elector of Hanover, in which they rank Mr. Waverley among the nobility and gentry who are menaced with the pains of high treason for loyalty to their legitimate sovereign. But I desire to gain no adherence save from affection and conviction. And if Mr. Waverley inclines to prosecute his journey to the south, or to join the forces of the Elector, he shall have my passport and free permission to do so. And I can only regret that my present power will not extend to protect him against the probable consequences of such a measure. But," continued Charles Edward, after another short pause, "if Mr. Waverley should, like his ancestor Sir Nigel, determine to embrace a cause which has little to recommend it but its justice, and follow a prince who throws himself upon the affections of his people to recover the throne of his ancestors, or perish in the attempt, I can only say that among these nobles and gentlemen he will find worthy associates in a gallant enterprise, and will follow a master who may be unfortunate, but, I trust, will never be ungrateful."
So not far from where I stand once stood the heart of Midlothian, the old toll booth, the Edinburgh prison, which was here for many, many years. And it was demolished only early in the 19th century in 1817. Now, the heart of Midlothian, we still have the tiled mosaic which marks the entrance to the prison, where the entrance to the prison would have been, and also the bricks that mark the outlines of where the rest of the building would have been as well. And it would have obscured quite a large part of the view that we have of the Royal Mile too in its day. Now, it was also built with a theatrical intention in mind. Prior to 1785, executions would have taken place at the Mercat Cross, just behind St Giles Cathedral, but after 1785 they would take place in the old toll booth, and there was a purpose-built theatrical scaffold where a crowd could assemble and watch the spectacle as well. And again, that would have been parallel with the entrance of St Giles Cathedral here. Now, when the prison was demolished in 1817, Scott made sure that he secured for himself some relics of the building, some relics of the old toll booth. And so he took for himself a large doorway through which inmates would have left the prison to meet their fate, to meet their execution. He also took a large gigantic set of keys and a couple of large locks as well from the toll booth. Now, it's tempting to think as well that these objects that Scott collected from the toll booth, these relics, would help him to feel his way into a story about the prisoner which took place in the prison. For indeed, just about a year after he'd witnessed the destruction of the old toll booth, he wrote a novel of the same name, The Heart of Midlothian. Now, the centre of Scott's novel centres around two sisters, Jeanie and Effie Deans. Now, Effie had been imprisoned in the old toll booth as she was accused of infanticide, and it was put to the two sisters that if it could be proved that Effie had actually told her sister of her pregnancy, then she wouldn't be executed. And Jeanie, a staunch Cameronian, she couldn't tell the lie that would save her sister, and she said, alack, she didn't tell me about it. Now, before you think that Jeanie is a heartless sister, rather than telling a lie, she went one better, and she walked about 400 miles in Scott's novel down to London to plead Effie's case directly to the Queen, to Queen Caroline. And a particularly heartfelt address Jeanie delivers to the Queen, all the while she's thinking about her sister Effie languishing in the old toll booth that would have once stood here. And so let's hear in Jeanie's own words that appeal she made directly to Queen Caroline to save her sister.
My sister, my poor sister Effie still lives, though her days and hours are numbered. She still lives, and a word of the king's mouth might restore her to a broken-hearted old man that never in his daily and nightly exercise forgot to pray that his majesty might be blessed with a long and prosperous reign, and that his throne and the throne of his posterity might be established in righteousness. Oh, madam, if ye ever kenned what it was to sorrow for and with a sinning and suffering creature, whose mind is sae tossed that she can neither be called fit to live or die, have some compassion in her misery. Save an honest house from dishonour, and an unhappy girl not yet 18 years of age from an early and dreadful death. Alas, it is not when we sleep soft and wake merrily ourselves that we think on other people's sufferings. Our hearts are wax light within us then, and we are for righting our ain wrongs and fighting our ain battles. But when the hour of trouble comes to the mind or to the body, and seldom may it visit your ladyship, and when the hour of death comes, that comes to high and low, lang and late may it be yours. Oh, my lady, then it isna what we hae done for ourselves, but what we hae done for others that we think of most pleasantly.
Effie's plight and Jeanie's journey emerged from a real story related to Scott. Not an Edinburgh story, but being from Dumfries, not too far away. It was communicated to Scott by a Helen, Mrs. Helen Goldie, the wife of Thomas Goldie, and it was about a Helen, Helen Walker, who in Scott's novel becomes Jeanie Deans. Scott's fictionalised rendering of this real tale collides with another real story, a particularly infamous Edinburgh story belonging to the old toll booth. For Scott opens his novel with an account of the Porteous riots, events of which took place in 1736. Events began when two housebreakers or thieves named Wilson and Robertson, who had been tried and found guilty, were awaiting execution in the old toll booth. They made a final attempt to escape by filing down the iron bars of their cell, but the plan was thwarted by the larger of the two men, Wilson, who attempted to squeeze his way out first, ignoring poor Robertson's suggestion that he, smaller and more lithe, should go first and then render assistance from the outside. Wilson felt all the guilt of his mistake and so made a plan of his own to save his accomplice from the fate of execution by accosting the executioner at the critical moment. He did just that, and Robertson escaped, but Wilson was still to be executed. Responding to rumours that a rescue mission was afoot for the heroic Wilson, the order was put out that the city guard should attend the execution armed under the command of Captain Porteous. When the time came, Wilson's execution was awaited with bated breath and attended by thousands, and under the watchful eye of Porteous, the execution went ahead. Afterwards, tensions mounted and unrest followed, culminating in the open fire of the city guard and the death of a number at the scene. Incensed by the opening of fire upon the crowd, the people demanded justice, and later the same day Porteous was imprisoned, somewhat ironically ending up in the old toll booth, and was charged eventually with murder. Such was the feeling in the city that actually before the sentence of the law could be carried out, a crowd stormed the old toll booth where Porteous was, and what followed is best described by Scott himself. Reality and fiction collide as Porteous is borne down from the prison through the West Bow and to the Grassmarket, where clergyman Reuben Butler, Jeannie's fiancé, is called upon to give him last rites, witnessing in the process the following menacing scene.
And determined pace. It was enlightened by many blazing links and torches, for the actors of this work were so far from affecting any secrecy on the occasion that they seemed even to court observation. Their principal leaders kept close to the person of the prisoner, whose pallid yet stubborn features were seen distinctly by the torchlight, as his person was raised considerably above the concourse which thronged around him. Those who bore swords, muskets, and battle-axes marched on each side, as if forming a regular guard to the procession. The windows, as they went along, were filled with the inhabitants, whose slumbers had been broken by this unusual disturbance. Some of the spectators muttered accents of encouragement, but in general they were so much appalled by the sight, so strange and audacious, that they looked on with a sort of stupefied astonishment. No one offered, by act or word, the slightest interruption. As they descended the bow towards the fatal spot where they designed to complete their purpose, it was suggested that there should be a rope kept in readiness. For this purpose, the booth of a man who dealt in cordage was forced open, a coil of rope fit for the purpose was selected to serve as a halter, and the dealer next morning found that a guinea had been left on his counter in exchange. So anxious were the perpetrators of this daring action to show that they meditated not the slightest wrong or infraction of law, excepting so far as Porteous was himself concerned. Leading or carrying along with them, in this determined and regular manner, the object of their vengeance, they at length reached the place of common execution, the scene of his crime, and destined spot of his sufferings. Several of the rioters, if they should not rather be described as conspirators, endeavoured to remove the stone which filled up the socket in which the end of the fatal tree was sunk when it was erected for its fatal purpose. Others sought for the means of constructing a temporary gibbet, the place in which the gallows itself was deposited being reported too secure to be forced, without much loss of time. Butler endeavoured to avail himself of the delay afforded by these circumstances to turn the people from their desperate design.
Upon their rediscovery in 1818, it was over 100 years since the honours of Scotland had performed their final duty, and they were interred within a strong chest, and put in one of the rooms here in Edinburgh Castle. Now, that wasn't the final chapter in their story, rather they'd had quite a few exciting chapters in their long history. Prior to this, they'd been concealed within the walls of Dunnottar Castle, and they'd actually even been interred beneath the floor of Kenneth Parish Church as well. However, it wasn't so much of a secret that the honours of Scotland were concealed within Edinburgh Castle. Rather, it seems that people did know where they were. It just took the impulse of Walter Scott to actually find out where exactly they were and to bring them to light and bring them once more to public view. Now, it's a fantastic story, and therefore in many ways it seems surprising that Scott didn't decide to put this in one of his novels. He didn't decide to render this fantastic story right from Edinburgh into a fictional form. And perhaps the reason for that is the story in its own right is one of those where fact is in fact a little bit stranger than fiction. Or perhaps it's that Scott saw here in this story of the honours of Scotland an opportunity to insert himself into one of Scotland's or Edinburgh's most famous stories, and rather than writing a fiction for the city, he implanted himself right in the heart of one of the city's most famous stories.